Good afternoon and congratulations on your recent appointment. My name is Daniel Harper and I serve as the Vice Chancellor and CFO of the Texas State University System. With me today is Dr. Carlos Hernandez, the CFO and Senior VP for Operations at Sam Houston State University. Our presentation today will provide an overview of the budgeting process for public universities. Our agenda today will cover the state budget overview, higher education formula funding, specifically for general academic institutions. Carlos will cover institutional funding and budget activities and long-range strategic financial planning. As y'all may know well, the regular legislative session runs January through May of odd-numbered years. It covers a 2-year period, and our fiscal years in Texas are from September 1st through August 31st. As we say, the funding decisions are conclusive, but subject to change. The state budget is comprised of primarily 4 funding sources: general revenue that's dedicated to a specific purpose, federal funds, and other funds, which include the State Highway Fund, bond proceeds, and for those associated with A&M and the University of Texas system, the available university fund. For higher education, we receive predominantly all of our funding through general revenue. Next. The state budget for fiscal 2020-2021 of all funding sources is $251 billion, with almost half of it coming from general revenue and the other largest component being federal funds, which represents 34%. I would note on this slide that the federal funds referenced do not include federal research dollars or federal financial aid dollars received by institutions of higher education. The state budget is broken up into many functions, which are referred to as articles. Public education and higher education are found in Article 3 of the budget. You'll note here that Health and Human Services and public education account for more than 60% of the all funds appropriation in the current biennium. Higher education is around 9%. This slide breaks down the appropriation by function limited just to general revenue. You'll see a similar trend as in the previous slide, where Health and Human Services and public education account for more than 70% of the general revenue obligation of the state of Texas. Higher education receives about $16 billion biennially in general revenue from the Texas legislature. The legislature has higher education broken up into 7 general areas: Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, the community colleges, general academic institutions, health-related, the Lamar State colleges, and Texas State Technical colleges, which are also 2-year institutions, and the Texas A&M service agencies. Today, we were asked to focus on general academic institutions. These are the state's public universities. This slide shows the core components of the funding structure for public universities. While not identical, you will see similarities in the funding structure across the other sectors of higher education. Public universities receive state support for operations, for debt service on tuition revenue bonds, for capital funds, funds to support research, and then funding for other activities that aren't aligned in those categories. And additionally, public universities receive benefits for employees who are funded with state appropriations. Public universities receive $5.4 billion of general revenue in the current biennium to support their operations. 67% of this funding to our public universities come from the primary funding formulas for operations and infrastructure. There are 2 major components and 2 supplements that make up the main funding formula: instruction and operations, which has a teaching experience supplement, and infrastructure support, which has a small institution supplement. These formulas, while different, are all driven by the same core metric, which is semester credit hours. The instruction and operations component is driven by semester credit hours that are weighted. The infrastructure support component is ultimately rooted in semester credit hours as well, but is adjusted for academic program mix, staff size, research expenditures, and library collections. And then finally, the teaching experience supplement is also driven by semester credit hours, but those taught by tenure and tenure track faculty. In the instruction and operations formula, the semester credit hours are weighted. This weighting reflects the difference in the cost related to teaching courses at different levels and in different academic fields. For example, graduate courses are expected to be taught in smaller class sections than undergraduate classes, therefore causing a higher cost to provide that course. Similarly, courses in different fields also have higher costs than others. All these weights are displayed in the next slide in a chart titled Formula Matrix. This matrix is for the current biennium and adopted by the legislature. You'll see the different weighting by academic field, also by level, lower division, upper, etc. The teaching experience supplement is an add-on to the instruction and operations formula. This is designed to provide an incentive for institutions to assign tenure and tenure track faculty to teach undergraduate courses, not using TAs or adjuncts to teach those students. Since inception, the teaching experience supplement has been a 10% weight on the weighted semester credit hours. Here we highlight the instruction rate over time for public universities. First established for the 2002-2003 biennium, the rate per weighted semester credit hour was just shy of $57. You can see how the rate has moved over time and how we have settled around $55 per weighted semester credit hour since the 2016-17 biennium. To calculate the instruction and operation component of the formula, you take the semester credit hours times the weights times the rate established by the legislature. This yields the all funds funding level by institution. To determine the general revenue available to those institutions, you must then subtract out the estimated amount of statutory tuition an institution will collect over the next 2 years. Infrastructure support. Infrastructure support is driven by the predicted square feet projected by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board in their space model. These predicted square feet are multiplied by the infrastructure rate established by the legislature to yield the all funds formula amount, similar to how instruction is calculated. This funding provides support for the daily maintenance and for utility costs. The infrastructure support, as mentioned earlier, also includes a small institution supplement. This supplement provides additional funds to institutions with a smaller student headcount to help address the lack of scale experienced at those institutions. One of the great debates in higher education formula funding is whether the formula drives funding level or purely allocates the funding available by institution. I would argue that the formula fundings serve both purposes, both to influence the funding levels as well as an allocation methodology amongst institutions. For funding level, the coordinating board and institutions have historically requested that the legislature fund enrollment growth to maintain the rates, and when funding is available, additional funding to address inflation. When the legislature supports funding the rates, this does drive increased funding to institutions. However, when the funding rate is not maintained, these formulas do serve as a mechanism to distribute higher education funding, not to increase it. Universities growing slower than the average end up with lower funding, while faster growing institutions benefit. At this time, I'd like to turn over to my friend, Dr. Carlos Hernandez, to discuss institutional budgeting.
Thank you, Daniel. I too wish to congratulate you on your recent appointment and know that the work that you will do over the succeeding years is critical to guiding the work of our institutions or systems in advancing state goals and objectives. Thank you for your service. Daniel provided an overview of the funding sources for the state budget. And in these, he went into great detail as to the funds allocated to institutions of higher education in the state. This includes state funds or appropriated funds, which is composed of general revenue dedicated, which is primarily statutory tuition, and other income that's appropriated as part of the legislative process. Institutions of higher education generate revenues through a variety of non-appropriated activities. These include designated funds, which is primarily composed of designated tuition, which is set by the Board of Regents, and incidental fees that are collected from each individual student enrollment. Auxiliary enterprises are a significant portion of non-appropriated activities, and these include the ever-popular athletics, along with food services, housing, and other activities. Restricted funds also compose a significant portion of non-appropriated activities, and these are made up primarily of research funds and grant funds that are pass-through activities for scholarship support to our students. As Daniel mentioned, the higher education allocation statewide is approximately $15.8 billion a year. 28% of this is state appropriated, 30% of it is collected in the form of local tuition and fees, 14% of it is federal and dedicated to specific underlying efforts as defined in the contracts and grants underlying these agreements. And 28% is institutional resources, the lion's share of which is from auxiliary enterprises. The budget processing and development calendar is similar, whether it's a legislative year or a non-legislative year. That process usually extends from February through March. And during this February to March period, the university develops its initial estimates and budget policies based on predicted enrollment and anticipated costs to support future operations. June and July is a busy time period as budget offices across the state are busy working and finalizing the budget proposals that are submitted to the system and Board of Regents for consideration and approval, typically at their August meeting. These budgets are then effective for September 1st of the following fiscal year. It is important to note that May is a critical date in that that's when on odd numbered years, the legislature will finalize their budgeting processes and finalize the funding levels for all state agencies, including higher education, for the succeeding 2 fiscal years. There are a number of external influences that affect our budget planning and priorities, and these include the direction of the system office operations, along with the input of the Board of Regents. Donors and alumni are critical in defining the goals and objectives for institutional activities. The legislature plays a significant role in this conversation as well. Parents and students both inform these decisions as well through their desire for academic programming. The general public and the media also impact these conversations. However, it's not limited to external influences. Internal influences at the organizational level are also prevalent in terms of employment trends, enrollment trends for students in succeeding periods, and how these enrollment trends affect programming. All of these external and internal pressures are considered in establishing the budget policies and priorities for the institution and communicated to or the leadership all the way up to the Board of Regents for consideration as part of the overall budget. Legislative appropriations requests, as I mentioned previously, are prepared on in even numbered years for consideration by the legislature during their legislative sessions on odd number years. The legislative session initiates in January of the odd number year and will typically take place from January through the end of May, where they consider the legislative appropriations requests that are prepared by each individual state agency and institution of higher education. The legislative appropriation request only reflects state funding and includes financial details for prior fiscal years, the current budget period, and the prospective budget year. It generally allows level funding for previous years and also provides an opportunity for requesting additional funding in the form of exceptional items. Budget considerations include all of the following elements. Institutions must engage in predictive analytics related to enrollment, as these have a direct impact on their tuition and fee collections. State appropriations in odd numbered years are subject to the legislative process and are not finalized until the end of the legislative session. Institutions must also examine and prioritize incremental expenditures for initiatives that they have already approved in prior years, and ensure that these are aligned with achieving university and state goals and objectives. Institutions should also engage in examining their current cost exposure and identify opportunities for cost reduction or increased efficiencies that will enable reallocation of resources to achieve the underlying state goals and objectives. And then determine a solution for any shortfall that's identified in their budget consideration processes. Strategic financial planning is a concept that transcends the annual budget planning process. The budget describes revenue and expenses expectations for a year ahead and is typically based on historical experience from an enrollment perspective and a commitment from the state for funding levels over a 2-year period. This is a relatively short-term horizon and is insufficient for dealing with long-term uncertainties facing higher education today. Long-range plans generally of 5 years are encouraged, although they're not required. And integrated strategic financial plans should identify where the institution wants to be in the future and how it plans to get there through program development and financial resource allocation. This long-range planning allows institutions to quantify strategic initiatives, and this quantitative analysis renders a view of future performance that can inform budget targets. It provides a set of operating assumptions for future budget exercises, and it also provides quantitative metrics that can be used in conjunction with other qualitative metrics to measure programmatic success. Nationally, higher education continues to face unprecedented pressures. Demographic trends across the country are working against higher education in many states. These states are also experiencing an increase in first-generation students, which generally require additional support and resources to succeed in higher education, a reduction in state appropriation support that then may translate into an increased cost of attendance to individual students and their families, an increase in competition for research dollars, and an overall erosion of perceived value of higher education, which is probably the largest pressure at a national level. In Texas, the situation is a little bit more favorable. We have strong enrollment demand across our institutions that is supported by strong demographic growth. However, it's important to keep in mind that the strong demographic growth is also very high in first-generation students, and that this demographic growth is also an opportunity for out-of-state institutions to come and recruit these students away. So we're not only competing amongst each other, we're competing with the rest of the country to maintain our enrollments. Thankfully, the state legislature has maintained their commitment to fund higher education at the highest levels possible given resources available to them. And Texas continues to have some of the nation's strongest research institutions, making us very competitive in the research field. All these factors combine to present a very favorable set of conditions for higher education in the state of Texas. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and thank you for your service.